It was 9:17 on a Saturday morning when the sound of sirens shattered my backyard calm. 3 police cruisers screamed into my driveway, gravel crunching beneath their tires like breaking bones. I was standing there, sweat dripping from my forehead, hands wrapped around a cedar fence post I had been installing for my new backyard workshop. When the officers stepped out, hands resting on their belts, I thought there must have been a mistake. Then I saw her, Cordelia Blackthorne, the president of the Maplewood Estates Homeowners Association, standing smugly beside her white Lexus, arms crossed like a queen surveying her domain. She pointed at me and announced, "That man is trespassing on HOA property." I blinked, confused for half a second before the absurdity hit me. Trespassing? In my own backyard? What she did not know, and what she was about to learn in the most humiliating way possible, was that I am Judge Harrison Webb, the municipal judge with jurisdiction over every code enforcement, zoning dispute, and property rights case in our county. In other words, the one man who could shut down her entire little empire with one stroke of a pen. But that morning, I said nothing. I just leaned on my shovel and watched her tighten the noose she had tied around her own neck. After 20 years on the bench, I thought I had earned peace. My marriage had ended quietly 6 months earlier, leaving behind an empty house and a silence that felt more like a courtroom after a verdict, final, echoing, heavy. So I looked for a fresh start, somewhere I could rebuild myself without hearing the constant ticking of a clock reminding me of everything I had lost. Maplewood Estate seemed perfect, a quiet, tree-lined suburb 30 minutes outside Riverside County, 147 homes, neat lawns, and children who still played outside instead of staring into phones. I bought a corner lot house with a large backyard, space enough for the woodworking shop I had dreamed of for years. The HOA dues were high but manageable, and the neighborhood brochure promised order, tranquility, and community pride. I had no idea those words would soon translate to control, fear, and corruption. Cordelia Blackthorne introduced herself during my first week. She appeared on my porch with a clipboard and perfume strong enough to stun livestock. Mid-40s, sharp bob haircut, smile too perfect to be sincere. "Welcome to Maplewood, Judge Webb," she said, already aware of my occupation. "We take our community standards very seriously here." She handed me a packet of HOA bylaws thick enough to rival a courtroom statute book. At the bottom of the first page, in delicate cursive, she had written, "Harmony through compliance." At the time, I mistook it for civic pride. Later, I realized it was her motto of domination. My first run-in with Cordelia came 3 weeks later. A teenager with a baseball bat had smashed my mailbox late one night, so the next morning I replaced it with an identical model from the hardware store. Same color, same height, same style. I was halfway through my morning coffee when I heard the heavy thud of certified mail hitting my porch. Inside was a violation notice from the HOA. Unapproved exterior modification. Fine, $150, increasing $50 per day until corrected. I actually laughed. Surely this was a mistake. But when I checked the bylaws, I found nothing about mailboxes. So I walked to the neighborhood and took photos, dozens of mailboxes, some newer than mine, none identical, none cited. That evening, my neighbor Marcus stopped by with 2 beers and a sympathetic grin. "Let me guess," he said, "Cordelia's found a new target." Marcus was an electrician who had lived in Maplewood for 8 years. He told me stories. Fines for solar panels, threats for painting shutters the wrong shade of beige, harassment that bordered on obsession. "She goes after anyone new," he said. "People with real jobs, people who don't worship her authority." By the end of that conversation, I knew 2 things. 1, my violation was not a mistake. And 2, Cordelia was exactly the kind of bully I had spent my life holding accountable from the bench. 2 months later came the spark that ignited everything. I had applied for HOA approval to build a 6-foot cedar privacy fence. Nothing extravagant, just enough to create workspace for my tools. The HOA charged me a $75 review fee and promised a response within 30 days. 47 days later, I still had nothing. So I hired a licensed surveyor, confirmed my property lines, and started digging post holes myself. The sun had barely cleared the rooftops when Cordelia's white Lexus crept around the corner like a predator on the prowl. She slammed the car door, heel stabbing into my lawn, and barked, "Stop right there. You're violating HOA property lines." I calmly handed her the surveyor's report. "Every post is 6 inches inside my property," I said. "Verified coordinates. Permits filed." She snatched the papers, scanning them with the desperation of someone trying to bend reality. When they failed to support her narrative, she pulled out a cheap measuring tape and shouted, "I don't care what your papers say. The HOA has easement rights." That was when I pulled out my phone and started recording. She didn't notice. She walked 20 feet across my yard, still trespassing, and called the police on speakerphone. "Yes, I need officers immediately," she said, pacing in her designer heels. "A man is trespassing on HOA property and destroying community assets." When the officers arrived, I stayed silent. Sergeant Rodriguez stepped out first, a man who had testified in my courtroom dozens of times. His eyes widened. "Your Honor," he said. Cordelia's face drained of color. "Wait, your judge." Rodriguez reviewed my paperwork, nodded once, and turned to her. "Ma'am, this gentleman is well within his legal rights. You're actually trespassing on his property." Her retreat was awkward and stiff, like a puppet whose strings had been cut. But that was the moment I decided I was done tolerating her abuse. Cordelia Blackthorne had just declared war on the wrong man. That evening, I opened the HOA's publicly available budget reports. Something immediately fell off. Maplewood Estates collected nearly $400,000 a year in dues. Yet the community center looked like it hadn't been cleaned since the Clinton administration. Landscaping alone accounted for $89,000, all paid to the same contractor, Pinnacle Property Services. Curiosity turned to suspicion when I discovered that Pinnacle's registered owner was Derek Blackthorne, Cordelia's brother-in-law. Over the next week, I gathered everything I could: screenshots of social media harassment, copies of fake violation letters, photos of unmaintained areas that supposedly consumed half our budget. I built a digital case file thicker than most criminal dockets. That was when the retaliation began. Every morning brought a new violation notice: unapproved landscaping, improper storage of garden tools, vehicle parked at incorrect angle. The fines totaled $800 in 5 days. Neighbors whispered apologies at the mailbox, too afraid to speak up publicly. But fear has never been my language. Evidence is. I requested a special board meeting, open to residents under state law. Cordelia tried to block it, claiming I had a conflict of interest. I reminded her that conflicts only exist when one has something to hide. When I walked into the community center, 3 board members sat behind a folding table: Cordelia, Treasurer Frank DeLacro, and Secretary Bob Morrison. 2 chairs were conspicuously empty. The other members had conveniently called in sick. Cordelia opened with her usual smug smile. "Judge Webb, we are here to discuss your ongoing noncompliance." I placed a thick folder on the table. "Actually," I said, "we're here to discuss yours." I began presenting photos of identical mailboxes that had never been fined, landscaping invoices with missing signatures, and copies of HOA checks written to Pinnacle Property Services. Each document landed like a hammer blow. Bob Morrison frowned. "Cordelia, do we ever approve these contracts?" Her face tightened. "This is harassment. He's abusing his judicial position to intimidate volunteers." I met her glare and said evenly, "I'm acting as a homeowner exercising his legal rights. And as a judge, I recognize fraud when I see it." The meeting ended in chaos, but the damage was done. The board was cracking. Cordelia's empire had fractures she couldn't patch with perfume and threats. Over the next month, her behavior turned desperate. Flyers appeared on doorsteps accusing me of terrorizing the HOA. Fake complaints flooded city offices. Someone even slashed Marcus's truck tires. But instead of dividing the neighborhood, Cordelia united it against her. Residents began comparing stories. Mrs. Chin showed me violation letters dating back 5 years. A young couple revealed they had been fined for leaving children's toys in their yard. Each story painted the same picture: selective enforcement, intimidation, and greed. I contacted my friend Patricia Valdez, a county prosecutor known for handling white-collar crime. When I handed her the evidence, she whistled low. "Harrison," she said, "this isn't just corruption. This is embezzlement." She opened an investigation quietly, while I prepared for the next battlefield, the annual HOA meeting, where Cordelia would face the people she had ruled through fear. By the time the meeting arrived, the tension in Maplewood was thick enough to touch. Every chair in the community center was filled. Reporters stood near the back, notebooks ready. Cordelia opened with a brittle smile. "We will begin tonight's meeting with a discussion of resident behavior." I stood before she could continue. "Correction," I said. "We will begin with accountability." I projected images onto the screen: invoices, forged signatures, overlapping payments. Gasps rippled through the crowd. $89,000, I said, paid to Pinnacle Property Services, owned by your brother-in-law. $47,000 for pool maintenance that never happened. $23,000 in insurance claims for fake landscaping damage. Cordelia's voice cracked. "Those are administrative errors." "Then explain why the checks were deposited into your personal account." Silence. Reporters scribbled furiously. Residents whispered. One board member quietly slid away from the table and out the door. That was when two uniformed officers entered from the back. Sergeant Rodriguez nodded at me, then at Cordelia. "Ma'am, you're under investigation for fraud and embezzlement." The color drained from her face for the second time since we met. She tried to protest, but the handcuffs clicking around her wrists drowned out her excuses. Cordelia's arrest made headlines by morning. The county froze the HOA accounts pending audit. Within days, her allies resigned. A temporary board was appointed, including me as acting president until new elections. The audits confirmed everything. Over $127,000 diverted through fake contracts, inflated invoices, and personal expenses. The district attorney's office filed multiple felony charges. But beyond the legal victory, something more important happened. The neighborhood began to heal. Marcus organized weekend cleanups. Mrs. Chin replanted her garden without fear. The new board instituted open financial reporting and resident voting for all expenditures. For the first time in years, Maplewood felt like a community rather than a dictatorship. When the ethics committee later reviewed my involvement, they ruled unanimously that I had acted within my rights as a private citizen. One member even said, "You reminded us why the law exists, to protect people from those who think they're above it." 6 months later, Maplewood was unrecognizable. The pool sparkled, lawns thrived, and laughter replaced tension. Property values rose not because of oppressive rules, but because people finally wanted to live here again. One evening, as the sun dipped low, Marcus and I sat on my back porch watching kids chase fireflies near my now famous fence. The same fence that had started it all. He raised his beer and said, "Guess justice really does build good fences." I laughed, only when the law holds the hammer. Later that night, I walked the perimeter of my yard, the cedar boards glowing gold in the fading light. I thought about how easily power can corrupt when unchecked, and how quickly silence can turn good people into prisoners in their own homes. Cordelia Blackthorn's downfall had become a lesson etched into every plank of that fence. That true authority serves, it never rules. And as I stood there listening to the peaceful sounds of my neighborhood, I realized something profound. Justice does not always wear a robe or sit behind a bench. Sometimes it holds a shovel in the Texas heat, digging post holes while waiting for truth to show up with sirens.